Some people avoid doctors because they're careless, others because they're terrified of what they might hear. He belonged to the second kind, and for years he lived pretending nothing was wrong. Tonight we open File 005, the man who avoided the hospital until it was too late.
He stopped believing in doctors the year his father died waiting in a hallway. The insurance letter arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. It said the procedure had been denied. Now, his body was sending letters of its own. The pain started like a rumor, something distant, half-believed, easy to dismiss. A tightness in his chest that came and went. A heaviness in his limbs that he blamed on the heat, the job, the 37 years of carrying things that didn't belong to him. He worked in a warehouse on the eastern edge of a city that never stopped expanding, where buildings rose like teeth and swallowed the sky. His name was Daniel Carver, though most people called him Dan, and he had learned early that survival meant keeping your head down and your symptoms to yourself. If you're enjoying this channel, leave a like and subscribe. Help this project grow. At the end, I'll reveal every file stored here. The warehouse smelled like cardboard and diesel, a combination that had worked its way so deep into his clothes that even after washing them twice, the scent remained. He moved boxes, scanned labels, loaded trucks. The work was repetitive, mechanical, the kind of labor that let your mind wander into places it shouldn't go. Lately, his mind had been wandering toward his body, which was strange because for most of its life, his body had simply been there. Functional, unremarkable, a vehicle that got him from one day to the next. But now, it was making noise, small creaks at first, then louder ones. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this for 6 months. The first time he collapsed was on a Tuesday during the afternoon shift. He was lifting a pallet when the world tilted sideways and the fluorescent lights above him flickered like they were trying to spell something urgent. He hit the concrete floor hard, shoulder first, and lay there for a moment, staring at the underside of a shelving unit covered in dust and ancient cobwebs. Someone shouted his name. Footsteps came running. Hands pulled him upright. "You good?" "Yeah." "You sure?" "Just slipped." He refused the offer to sit down, refused the suggestion that maybe he should go home early, refused the quiet concern in the eyes of his supervisor, a woman named Marlene, who had worked there longer than anyone and had seen enough people break in enough different ways to recognize. She watched him for the rest of the shift, her gaze following him like a spotlight he couldn't escape. That night, he sat in his apartment with the lights off and the television on, volume low, casting blue shadows across the walls. The apartment was small, efficiently joyless, the kind of place that came furnished with sadness. A couch that sagged in the middle, a table with one uneven leg, a single window that overlooked a parking lot where cars sat baking under the relentless sun. He had lived here for 4 years and had never hung anything on the walls. It felt temporary, though he knew by now it wasn't. His phone buzzed, a text from his sister. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" He stared at the message for a long time before typing back. "Yeah, busy with work." She didn't respond, and he was grateful. The truth was, he hadn't told anyone about the chest pain, the fatigue, the way his breathing sometimes felt like trying to pull air through a wet towel. He hadn't told anyone because telling someone made it real, and making it real meant doing something about it. and doing something about it meant entering a system that had chewed up his father and spit out paperwork. The American healthcare system, he had learned, was not designed for people like him. It was designed for people with better jobs, better insurance, better luck. It was a labyrinth of co-pays and deductibles, prior authorizations, and out-of-network penalties, a language he didn't speak and couldn't afford to learn. Every interaction with it felt like a negotiation he was destined to lose. When he was younger, he'd had a plan. He was going to go to community college, study something practical, get a job with benefits, build a life that included things like annual checkups and dental cleanings. But plans, he discovered, were fragile. His mother got sick. He started working full-time to help with bills. Community college became a someday that turned into a never. The job with benefits became the job he had now, which technically offered insurance, but the kind that required you to pay so much up front that it was almost easier to just avoid getting sick. So he had avoided it for years, and now his body was presenting him with the bill. The second collapse happened 3 weeks later, this time at the grocery store. He was reaching for a box of cereal when his legs simply stopped working. He went down between the aisles, his vision tunneling, his heartbeat loud in his ears like someone hammering on a door from the inside. A clerk helped him to a chair near the registers and asked if he wanted them to call an ambulance. No. You sure? You don't look good. I'm fine. We really should. I said I'm fine. He sat there for 20 minutes, breathing slowly, waiting for the world to solidify. When he finally stood up and walked out, leaving his groceries behind, he could feel the eyes of strangers on him, concerned, curious, relieved when he became someone else's problem. That night, he looked up his symptoms online, which was a mistake. The internet offered him 1,000 possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Heart disease, anemia, cancer, diabetes, kidney failure, autoimmune disorders, rare conditions with names he couldn't pronounce. He closed the laptop and sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the quiet, mechanical rhythm of a world that kept moving, whether you were keeping up or not. He thought about his father, who had been a man of routines. Coffee at 6, work at 7, home by 5, dinner at 6, television until 10. A life measured in small, predictable increments until the day it wasn't. His father had gone to the hospital complaining of chest pain and had been told to wait. He waited 4 hours in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights while forms were filled out and insurance was verified, and somewhere down a hallway someone decided his pain wasn't urgent enough. By the time they took him seriously, it was too late. The heart attack had already done its work. Daniel remembered sitting in that same waiting room afterward, staring at a poster about hand hygiene, thinking that his father had done everything right. He'd had insurance, he'd shown up, he'd asked for help, and still the system had failed him. After that, Daniel made a decision. He would not set foot in a hospital unless he was unconscious and someone else made the choice for him. It was a kind of protest, a refusal to participate in a machine that ground people into debt and despair. It was also a kind of fear, though he didn't admit that to himself until much later. At work, Marlene started watching him more closely. She would appear beside him during shifts, casually, as if by accident. "You eating enough?" "Yeah." "You sleeping?" "Enough." "Danny, if something's wrong, Nothing's wrong. But his hands were shaking when he said it, and they both knew. The warehouse was full of people like him, people who worked through pain, through sickness, through exhaustion, because taking a day off meant losing a day's pay, and losing a day's pay meant choosing between rent and food. It was an economy of endurance, a competition to see who could ignore their body the longest. Daniel had always been good at it. He'd worked through fevers, migraines, a sprained ankle that swelled up like a grapefruit. He'd learned to compartmentalize, to put the pain in a box in the back of his mind and lock it there. But the box was getting harder to close. One morning, he woke up and couldn't feel his left arm. The numbness lasted for an hour, creeping from his fingertips to his shoulder, a slow erasure. He sat on the edge of his bed and watched the sunlight move across the floor and told himself it was nothing. A pinched nerve, bad sleeping position, stress. It was always stress. He went to work. He scanned labels. He smiled when Marlene asked how he was doing and lied so smoothly that he almost believed himself. That weekend, his sister called. "I'm coming to visit." "You don't have to." "I want to. It's been too long." "I'm busy." "You're always busy, Danny. I'm coming next month." He didn't argue. Arguing required energy he didn't have. After the call, he sat on his couch and stared at the wall and felt something inside him shift. Not physically, but emotionally, psychologically. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you'd been standing there for a long time without noticing. One more step and you'd be gone. The fear wasn't falling. The fear was not knowing if anyone would notice you'd fallen until it was too. His body was trying to tell him something, but he had spent so long ignoring it that the message had become garbled, abstract, a language he couldn't quite translate. Pain was no longer a signal, but a constant companion. White noise in the background of his life. He had adapted to it the way people adapt to living near a highway. Eventually, you stop hearing the traffic, but the traffic was getting louder. The dreams started in October, when the first cold front moved through and the city pretended it had seasons. He would dream that he was back in the warehouse, but the boxes he was lifting were empty, weightless, and when he opened them, there was nothing inside except darkness. Or he would dream that he was sitting in a waiting room that stretched on forever, rows and rows of plastic chairs filled with people who never moved, never spoke, just stared ahead with expressions of infinite patience. In these dreams, his father was always there, sitting 3 chairs down, and Daniel would try to reach him, but the distance would expand with every step. He would wake up sweating, his heart racing, the sheets twisted around him like bandages. At work, he started making mistakes, small ones at first, scanning the wrong label, loading boxes onto the wrong truck, then bigger ones. He dropped a pallet that shattered on impact, spilling motor oil across the concrete. He forgot entire conversations moments after having them. His supervisor pulled him aside. "Danny, what's going on?" "Nothing. This isn't like you. I'm just tired." Marlene looked at him the way his mother used to look at him when he was a child and lying about breaking something. A look that said she knew, and she knew that he knew she knew, and the pretending was exhausting for both of them. "If you need time off, I don't. If you need to see someone, I'm fine." The word "fine" had become his default setting, the answer to every question, the shield he held up against concern. He said it so often, it stopped meaning anything. Fine was a country he had moved to and couldn't leave, a place where nothing was ever actually fine, but everyone pretended otherwise. The third collapse happened at home, which meant no witnesses, which meant he could pretend it hadn't happened at all. He was making coffee when his vision went black at the edges, narrowing to a pinpoint of light before disappearing entirely. He came to on the kitchen floor with a splitting headache and no clear memory of falling. The clock said 20 minutes had passed. The coffee maker was still running, filling the apartment with the smell of something burning. He sat there for a long time, his back against the his hands trembling, trying to decide what this meant, trying to calculate the cost of ignoring it versus the cost of acknowledging it. The math didn't work in his favor either way. His sister arrived on a Sunday, driving 6 hours from another version of the same struggling city, another collection of warehouses and strip malls, and people trying to hold themselves together. Her name was Rachel, and she was 3 years older and had inherited their mother's ability to see through bullshit. She took one look at him and said, "You look terrible." "Thanks. I'm serious, Danny. When's the last time you ate?" "I eat." "When's the last time you slept?" "I sleep." She set her bag down and walked through his apartment like she was cataloging evidence. She opened his refrigerator, which contained a carton of milk 2 weeks past its expiration date, half a jar of peanut butter, and nothing else. She checked his bathroom cabinet and found bottles of over-the-counter painkillers, some of them empty, some nearly empty. She sat down on his sagging couch and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts love and frustration. "What's going on?" "Nothing. Don't lie to me." "I'm just tired. Work's been busy." "You're not just tired." He wanted to tell her. He wanted to sit down and explain the chest pain, the numbness, the collapses, the fear that had worked its way so deep into his bones that it felt like architecture now, something load-bearing. But the words wouldn't come. They sat in his throat like stones. Instead, he said, "I'm handling it." "Handling what?" "Everything." Rachel stared at him for a long moment, and he could see her doing the same calculation he'd been doing for months, weighing how hard to push, how much to insist, when to respect someone's autonomy, and when to override it. In the end, she chose a middle path. "Come stay with me for a while." "I can't. I have work." "Take a leave." "I can't afford to." "Then let me help." "I don't need help." The lie hung in the air between them, obvious and ugly, and neither of them had the energy to address it directly. So they spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal. They went to a diner, and he pushed food around his plate while she talked about her job, her apartment, the life she'd managed to build of their shared childhood. She didn't mention their father. She didn't mention hospital. She was giving him space, and he was grateful for it, even as he knew the space was killing him. That night, she slept on his couch, and he lay awake in his bedroom, listening to the sound of her breathing in the next room. It had been years since another person had slept in his apartment. The presence was comforting and terrifying in equal measure. Comforting because it meant he wasn't alone. Terrifying because it meant someone was close enough to notice when things in the morning fell apart. She made him promise to call her if anything changed, if anything got worse, if he needed anything at all. He promised, knowing he wouldn't follow through. She hugged him in the doorway, holding on longer than usual, and when she pulled away, there were tears in her eyes that she didn't acknowledge. "I love you, Danny." "Love you too." He watched her drive away and felt something crack inside him, some final defense giving way. He closed the door and sat on the floor with his back against it and let himself cry for the first time in months. Not because he was in pain, though he was. Not because he was scared, though he was that too. But because he was so tired of carrying this alone and asking for help, felt like admitting defeat. And he had spent his entire life being told that defeat was not an option. The American dream, he thought, was the freedom to destroy yourself quietly. At work on Monday, Marlene called him into her office. It was a small room with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a motivational poster about teamwork that had been there so long it was sun-faded and peeling at the corners. She gestured for him to sit down. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About you. I'm fine." "Danny, you've been late 6 times this month. You've made more mistakes in the past 2 weeks than you've made in 2 years. You look like you haven't slept since the Bush administration, and I don't mean the recent one." He tried to smile. It didn't work. "I'm going through a rough patch. I'll get it together. I'm not saying this to punish you. I'm saying this because I'm worried. You need to see a doctor." The word doctor landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the room. "I don't need a doctor." "Yes, you do. I'm handling it." "You're not handling it. You're ignoring it, which is different." He stood up, suddenly angry, though he couldn't have said whether he was angry at her or at himself or at the entire system that had brought him to this moment. "You don't know what you're talking about." "My husband had a heart attack 3 years ago," Marlene said quietly. "He ignored the symptoms for 6 months because he was scared of the bills, scared of losing time at work, scared of what they might find. By the time he went to the ER, he needed triple bypass surgery. The recovery took 4 months. We're still paying off the debt." Daniel sat back down. "But he's alive," she continued, "and he wouldn't be if he'd waited any longer. So yeah, I do know what I'm talking about. And I'm telling you, whatever you think you're avoiding by not going to a doctor is worse than what will happen if you do go. You don't understand? Then help me understand." He wanted to explain it to her. The way the system felt designed to humiliate you, to extract every dollar you had, and then a few more you didn't. The way it turned sickness into a moral failure, as if being sick was evidence of poor planning, weak character, insufficient bootstrap pull. The way his father had died, not because medicine failed, but because bureaucracies. But the explanation felt too big, too complicated, too wrong. Instead, he said, "My insurance is terrible. The deductible is $5,000. I don't have $5,000. I don't have $500. If I go to a doctor and they find something, I'll lose everything trying to fix it. And if I lose everything, what's the point of fixing it?" Marlene was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "There are programs, payment plans, charity care. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's not enough. Maybe not, but it's better than dying in your apartment because you were too proud to ask for help." The words hit him like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, they weren't, but because they were true. And the truth was a mirror he'd been avoiding for months. "I need you to take some time off," Marlene said. "I'm not firing you. I'm not punishing you. But you need to take care of this before it takes care of you. Come back when you're ready." He left her office in a daze, collected his things from his locker, and walked out into the parking lot. The sun was too bright. The air was too hot. The world felt slightly unreal, like a set someone had built to look like his life, but had gotten the details wrong. He sat in his car for 20 minutes before he had the energy to drive home. That night, he lay in bed and thought about his father, about the way his father had believed in the system right up until the moment it betrayed him, about the way his father had done everything he was supposed to do, worked hard, paid his taxes, played by the rules, and had still ended up dead in a hospital hallway, about the way Daniel had inherited not just his father's fear of doctors, but his father's faith that America was a place where hard work mattered, where playing by the rules meant something. That faith was a ghost now, haunting him. In the weeks that followed, the symptoms got worse. The chest pain became constant, a dull ache that sharpened whenever he moved too quickly. The fatigue deepened until even walking from his bedroom to his bathroom felt like climbing a mountain. He stopped eating because his stomach rejected everything. He stopped sleeping because lying down made his heart rate. He stopped answering his phone because he didn't trust his voice not to give him away. Rachel called 16 times. He let it go to voicemail every time. Marlene texted, "How are you doing?" He typed back, "Better." Another lie added to the pile. He spent his days on the couch, half watching television, half sleeping, half living. The line between conscious and unconscious blurred until he couldn't tell which state he was in. Time became elastic, unreliable. Morning could last for hours or seconds. Night could stretch on forever or disappear in a blink. His body was shutting down, and he was watching it happen with a kind of detached curiosity, as if it were happening to someone else. November arrived with rain that fell like an accusation, steady and cold, turning the parking lot outside his window into a shallow lake that reflected nothing. He watched it from his couch, wrapped in a blanket that smelled like old laundry detergent and resignation. The television was on, but he wasn't watching it, just letting the noise fill the apartment so the silence wouldn't. His phone buzzed. Rachel again. "Danny, I'm getting worried. Please call me back." He stared at the message until the screen went dark, then set the phone face down on the coffee table. The distance between wanting to reach out and actually reaching out had become infinite. Every time he thought about picking up the phone, about saying the words, "I need help," something stopped him. Pride, maybe, or shame. Or the fear that asking for help would mean admitting he'd been wrong to avoid it for so long, that all this suffering had been preventable, that he'd done this to himself. The rain continued. Days passed. He wasn't sure how many. He started having conversations with his body, silent negotiations conducted in the dark hours before dawn. If you just hold on a little longer, he would think, "I'll get help. I promise, just give me a few more days to figure things out." But his body wasn't interested in negotiations anymore. It had moved past requests and into demands, and soon it would move past demands into consequences. There were moments of clarity, brief windows when the fog lifted and he could see himself from the outside. A man alone in a small apartment, slowly disappearing, choosing death over death, choosing silence over vulnerability. In those moments, he understood that this wasn't just about avoiding doctors or hospital. It was about something deeper, a belief buried so far down he'd forgotten it was there, that his suffering didn't matter, that he didn't deserve care, that asking for help was a form of weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. Where had he learned that? From his father, who had worked himself to exhaustion and called it responsibility. From the culture he'd grown up in, which treated poverty like a character flaw and sickness like a moral failure. from the thousand small humiliations of living in a country that promised opportunity but delivered cruelty, that said anyone could make it while ensuring most people didn't. He didn't know. He just knew it was true, the way bones know gravity. One morning, or maybe it was afternoon, time had lost its shape. He tried to stand and couldn't. His legs buckled immediately. He hit the floor hard, his shoulder connecting with the edge of the coffee table, sending his phone skittering across the carpet. He lay there breathing hard, waiting for the strength to try again. It didn't come. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. Alone on the floor of a cheap apartment, too stubborn to save himself. But even then, even with his face pressed against the stained carpet, even with his vision tunneling and his heart doing something arrhythmic and terrible in his chest, he didn't call anyone, because calling someone meant admitting he'd lost control, and control was the only thing he had left. Hours passed. The light outside shifted from gray to darker gray. The rain kept falling. Eventually, he managed to pull himself back onto the couch, using the last reserves of whatever energy remained in his failing body. He lay there in the darkness, too exhausted to move, too scared to sleep. His phone was somewhere on the floor, out of reach, just as well. In the silence, memory surfaced like something drowned, finally coming up for air. He was 8 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of his father's truck. They were driving home from the grocery store, and his father was talking about health insurance, the way adults talked about things that worried them in front of children, half explaining, half complaining, not quite aware the child was listening. "System's rigged," his father was saying. "You work hard, you pay your premiums, and then when you actually need something, they find a way to deny it. They always find a way." Young Daniel had asked, "Then why do we pay them?" His father had looked at him with an expression Daniel couldn't read at the time, but understood now. A mixture of defeat and protection, wanting to shield his son from the truth while knowing the truth would find him eventually anyway. "Because we don't have a choice," his father had said. "That's the trick. They make it so you can't afford not to have insurance, but you also can't. You're trapped either way." The memory dissolved. Daniel was back on his couch, in his failing body, in his dark apartment. His father had been right. The trap had closed around him just like it had closed around his father. The difference was his father had at least tried to fight it. Daniel had just decided not to play, but not playing didn't mean you won. It just meant you lost differently. Sometime during the night, he knew it was night because the parking lot lights were on, casting orange geometric shadows across his walls. He became aware of a sound. Knocking. Someone was knocking on his door. The sound was distant, irrelevant, part of a world he was no longer participating in. He ignored it. The knocking continued, grew louder, more insistent. Then a voice. "Danny, Danny, open up!" Rachel. He tried to call out, to tell her to go away, that he was fine, that she should leave him alone. But his voice came out as a whisper that didn't even reach the edge of the couch. "I'm calling the police," Rachel shouted through the door. "I'm not kidding. I haven't heard from you in 3 weeks. Open the door, or I'm getting the landlord to open it." He wanted to move. He wanted to stand up, walk to the door, prove to her that he was okay. But his body had become something separate from his will, a machine whose parts no longer responded to instructions. He managed to lift his arm, but it fell back down almost immediately. The knocking stopped. Voices outside, muffled. Rachel's voice, high and frightened. Another voice, male, tired, the landlord probably. The sound of keys, the door opening. Light flooded the apartment, obscene and revealing. Rachel appeared in his field of vision, her face white with shock. "Oh my God, Danny! Oh my God!" She was on her knees, her hands on his face, his neck, checking for something, a pulse maybe, signs of life. Her voice was shaking. "How long have you been like this? Why didn't you call me? Jesus Christ, Danny, why didn't you call?" He tried to answer, but his mouth wouldn't form words. "I'm calling 911. She already had her phone out. Her voice shifted, became clearer, more controlled, the voice of someone who had to hold it together because falling apart wasn't an option. "Yes, I need an ambulance. My brother, he's barely conscious. He's not responding, I think." "Yes, that's the address. Please hurry." She set the phone down and took his hand. Hers was warm. His was cold. The contrast was stark. "You're going to be okay," she said, and he could hear that she didn't believe it. "The ambulance is coming." "Okay. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because telling you would have made it real. Because making it real would have meant facing it. Because facing it would have meant entering the system. Because entering the system would have meant becoming another casualty. Because being a casualty would have meant proving that the American dream was a lie. And even dying felt preferable to admitting that. But he didn't say any of this. He just squeezed her hand, weakly, and hoped it was enough. The ambulance arrived with sirens and flashing lights that painted his walls red and blue. Colors of emergency, colors of too late. Paramedics filled his small apartment, professional and efficient, asking questions Rachel answered because he couldn't. Blood pressure, pulse, oxygen levels, numbers that meant his body was failing in specific, measurable ways. They lifted him onto a stretcher. The ceiling passed, the doorway, above him in the hallway, the parking lot, the rain on his face, cold and clean, the first time he'd been outside in weeks. The ambulance interior, bright and sterile, equipment everywhere. Rachel climbing in beside him, still holding his hand. "Stay with me," she was saying. "Stay with me, Danny." He wanted to tell her he wasn't going anywhere. He wanted to tell her he loved her. He wanted to tell her he was sorry for making her watch this, for putting her through this, for being the kind of brother who disappeared into his own suffering and dragged everyone who loved him down with him. Instead, he closed his eyes. The hospital was everything he'd feared and nothing he'd expected. The emergency room was chaos organized into efficiency. Doctors and nurses moving in patterns he couldn't track. Machines beeping in rhythms he didn't understand. Voices calling out numbers and medical terms that sounded like a foreign language. They cut his shirt off. They stuck needles in his arms. They attached monitors to his chest. They asked him questions he couldn't answer. Rachel stayed by his side the entire time, translating his silence into words, providing information he couldn't provide, being the advocate he'd refused to be for himself. At some point, a doctor appeared, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a voice that managed to be both gentle and urgent. "Daniel, can you hear me?" He nodded barely. "You're in heart failure. Your kidneys are failing. Your liver is damaged. You're severely malnourished and dehydrated. We're admitting you to the ICU. We need to run more tests, but right now we need to stabilize you. Do you understand?" He understood. He understood that everything he'd been afraid of finding out was worse than he'd imagined. He understood that the months of denial had turned what might have been manageable into catastrophic. He understood that he'd waited until it was almost too late, and maybe it was too late. Maybe all the interventions and medications and machines would only buy him a few more days, or he understood that he'd done this to himself. The doctor was still talking, explaining procedures, risks, next steps, but her voice was fading. Or maybe he was fading. The bright lights of the emergency room dimmed. The noise receded. Rachel's hand in his was the last thing he felt before consciousness slipped away completely. He dreamed he was in the warehouse, but it was empty now. No boxes, no trucks, no workers. Just an enormous space filled with echoes. His father was there, standing at the far end, and Daniel tried to call out to him, but no sound came. His father turned and started walking away deeper into the warehouse, disappearing into shadows that grew thicker with each step. "Wait," Daniel tried. "I have questions. I need to know if you were scared. I need to know if you regretted waiting. I need to know if this is what you wanted from me, this inheritance of fear and avoidance and slow self-destruction." But his father was gone, and Daniel was alone in the vast, empty space. The echo of his own heartbeat, the only sound. He woke to the sound of machines breathing for him or with him or at him. He couldn't tell which. The intensive care unit was a room carved from artificial light and antiseptic silence, punctuated by beeps that marked time in increments of survival. Tubes ran from his arms. Wires connected him to monitors that translated his body into numbers on screens. He was being measured, quantified, reduced to data points that would determine whether he lived or died. Rachel was asleep in a chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an angle that would hurt when she woke up. There were dark circles under her eyes. Her jacket was draped over her like a blanket. She'd been there for hours, maybe days. He had no sense of time anymore. It had become something that happened to other people. A nurse appeared, checked his vitals, made notes on a tablet. She noticed he was awake. "Welcome back," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" The question was absurd, but also earnest. He tried to answer and found he couldn't. There was a tube down his throat. The nurse saw his panic and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're intubated, just for a little while longer, until your breathing stabilizes. Don't try to talk. Just rest. Rest." As if rest were something he could do. As if his body knew how to do anything anymore except fail in increasingly inventive ways. But the nurse was kind, and kindness was unexpected enough that he let himself believe it might be genuine. Rachel stirred, opened her eyes, saw he was awake. Relief washed over her face, followed immediately by something harder to name. Anger, maybe, or grief, or the exhausted combination of both that comes from loving someone who won't save themselves. "You're awake," she said. Then, softer, "You scared the hell out of me." He wanted to apologize. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that he hadn't meant for it to go this far, that somewhere along the way he'd lost the ability to distinguish between choosing not to get help and being unable to ask for it. But the tube in his throat prevented speech, so he just looked at her, hoping his eyes could convey what his mouth couldn't. She took his hand again. "The doctors say you're going to make it. It's going to be a long recovery, and there's damage that might be permanent, but you're going to make it. Do you understand? You're going to live." The words hung in the air between them. You're going to live. It should have felt like victory, like relief, like the moment when the story turns and the protagonist is saved. But it didn't feel like any of It felt like an obligation he wasn't sure he could fulfill, a debt he'd have to spend years repaying. Over the next days, he learned later, it was 5 days, nearly a week of his life reduced to fragments of consciousness and chemical sedation, the full scope of the damage became clear. His heart was operating at 30% capacity. His kidneys were in acute failure, requiring dialysis. His liver was damaged but recovering. He was anemic, malnourished, dehydrated to the point where his organs had begun cannibalizing themselves for resources. The doctor who delivered this news did so with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen worse, which somehow made it more terrifying. If this wasn't the worst she'd seen, what was? If your sister hadn't found you when she did, the doctor said, you would have died, probably within 24 hours, maybe less. 24 hours. The margin between existence and erasure, between being a person with a story and being a statistic in a database somewhere, another preventable death, another life lost to the intersection of poverty and pride, and a healthcare system that treated survival as a privilege you had to earn. They removed the breathing tube on the 6th day. His first words were to Rachel, who had barely left his side. "I'm sorry?" She looked at him for a long time before answering. "I know. I should have called you." "Yes. I didn't know how." "I know that too." There was so much more to say, but the exhaustion was overwhelming. Speaking felt like running a marathon. Breathing felt like lifting weights. Existing felt like the hardest thing he'd ever done. We're going to talk about this. When you're stronger, we're going to talk about why you did this, and we're going to figure out how to make sure it never happens again. But right now, you just need to focus on getting better. Okay? He nodded. It was all he could manage. The days in the ICU blurred together. There were procedures he didn't understand, medications that made him feel disconnected from his own body, visits from specialists who explained things he couldn't retain. The physical pain was intense but manageable. The emotional pain was something else entirely, a weight that pressed on him constantly. The knowledge that he'd brought himself to this edge, that his suffering had been optional, that if he'd just swallowed his pride and fear and asked for help 6 months ago, none of this would have happened. But there was something else too, something unexpected, relief. The decision had been taken out of his hands. He was in the system now, for better or worse, and the system was keeping him alive. He didn't have to choose anymore. The choice had been made for him, and in the absence of choice, there was a kind of peace, however temporary. On the 8th day, they moved him out of the ICU to a regular hospital room. It had a window that looked out onto a parking garage, a view that was depressing in its ordinariness, but also comforting in its proof that the world was still out there, still functioning, still available to rejoin whenever he was ready. A social worker came to see him, a man in his 50s with a gentle manner and a folder full of paperwork. "Daniel, I want to talk to you about what happens next, the financial side of things." Here it was, the bill, the reckoning, the price of survival. "I know what you're thinking," the social worker. "And yes, this is going to be expensive, but there are programs, charity care, payment plans, disability assistance if you qualify. We're going to work through all of it together, okay? You're not going to have to figure this out alone." Daniel felt something crack inside him, some final defense giving way. He started crying, which hurt because his body was too weak for crying, but he couldn't stop. The social worker handed him tissues and waited patiently without judgment, without rushing him. "I thought," Daniel said when he could speak again, "I thought if I went to the hospital, it would destroy me financially. So I just didn't go, and I almost died instead." "You're not the first person to make that calculation," the social worker said, "and you won't be the last. The system is broken in a lot of ways, but you're here now. You're alive. And we're going to figure out how to keep you that way without bankrupting you. It's going to be hard, but it's possible. Hard, but possible." It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd allowed himself to believe for a long time. Over the following weeks, as his body began the slow work of healing, Daniel started having conversations, real ones, with Rachel, who told him she'd been terrified of losing him the way they'd lost their father, who made him promise he would never shut her out like that again. With Marlene, who visited twice and brought news from the warehouse and told him his job would be waiting when he was ready. No pressure, no timeline. With a therapist the hospital required him to see, who asked questions that made him uncomfortable and helped him understand that his avoidance of medical care was connected to deeper patterns of self-neglect and self-punishment. "You've been treating your own life as disposable," the therapist said. "Why do you think that is?" He didn't have a good answer. Or maybe he had too many answers, all of them tangled together. Because he'd grown up watching his father work himself to death and learned that was what men did. Because the world had taught him that his value was determined by his productivity, and when he couldn't be productive anymore, he lost his sense of worth. Because asking for help meant admitting weakness, and admitting weakness meant failure, and failure meant proving everyone right who'd ever said people like him didn't matter. "People like you do matter," the therapist said. "And part of recovery is going to be learning to believe that." It sounded simple when she said it. He knew it wouldn't be. The hospital bills arrived while he was still admitted, delivered in thick envelopes that Rachel intercepted before he could see them. When he was finally strong enough to review them, the numbers were astronomical, terrifying, exactly what he'd feared. But the social worker had been right. There were programs, waivers, reductions. The hospital wrote off a significant portion. The state covered some through emergency Medicaid. He would still owe money, more money than he had, but it was manageable in a way that complete financial ruin wasn't. "You'll pay it off eventually," Rachel said, "even if it takes years, but you'll be alive to pay it. Alive to pay it." The American compromise. They discharged him after 3 weeks, with prescriptions he couldn't afford, until Rachel helped him apply for assistance programs, with follow-up appointments he would have to keep, with instructions for recovery that included rest and nutrition and physical therapy, and all the things that required time and money he didn't have but would have to find, because the alternative was ending up back here or worse. Rachel drove him home, not to his apartment, but to hers, 6 hours away, where she'd set up a room for him and made it clear he'd be staying until he was stable. He didn't argue. He'd used up his quota of stubbornness. Her apartment was small but filled with light, with plants on the windowsills and photographs on the walls, proof of a life being lived rather than endured. She'd made soup, real soup, not from a can. The smell filled the space with something that felt like care made tangible. "You're going to get better," she said, serving him a bowl. "Not just physically, all of it. I'm going to make sure of it." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do, because you're my brother, and because if I don't, you'll convince yourself you don't deserve help, and you'll disappear again. So I'm not giving you a choice." He looked at her across the table, this woman who'd driven 6 hours to break down his door, who'd held his hand in the ambulance, who'd slept in hospital chairs and navigated bureaucracy and refused to let him die alone. And he understood that this was what survival looked like, not the machines or the medications or the procedures. This, someone who loved you refusing to let you go. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. Just get better." Recovery was slow and painful and filled with setbacks. There were days when the fatigue was so overwhelming he couldn't get out of bed. Days when the depression that had been lurking at the edges of his consciousness moved to the center and convinced him that survival wasn't worth the effort. Days when the medical bills came and he had to resist the urge to just give up, to stop taking his medications, to let his body finish what it had started. But Rachel was there, and on the days when she couldn't be there physically, texted, reminded him that he wasn't alone, even when he felt alone. And slowly, incrementally, his body began to remember how to function. His heart strengthened. His kidneys recovered enough that he no longer needed dialysis. His appetite returned. The color came back to his face. 6 months after the collapse, he went back to work. Not full time, not yet, but enough. Marlene welcomed him back with a hug that lasted longer than necessary and didn't ask questions about where he'd been or what had happened. The warehouse looked the same. The boxes were the same. The fluorescent lights still flickered, but something had changed in how he moved through the space. He was more careful now, more aware, more willing to stop when his body told him to stop. "Good to have you back," Marlene said. "Good to be back." And he meant it, which surprised him. He started seeing the therapist regularly, paying what he could afford, which wasn't much, but she worked with him on a sliding scale. They talked about his father, about fear, about the way poverty traps you in impossible choices. They talked about self-worth and vulnerability and the radical act of asking for help. Progress was slow. Some weeks he felt like he was getting better. Other weeks he felt like he was just treading water. But he kept showing up, which the therapist said was the important part. A year after the hospitalization, he moved back to his own apartment. Rachel was reluctant to let him go, but she understood he needed to prove to himself that he could do it. He set up his space differently this time. He hung pictures on the walls. He bought a plant. He kept his medications organized in a pill case and set reminders on his phone. He called Rachel twice a week. He went to his follow-up appointments. He asked questions when he didn't understand something. He was learning slowly how to live as someone who deserved to be alive. The medical debt would take years to pay off. The physical damage to his heart and kidneys would never fully heal. The psychological scars from months of self-imposed isolation would require ongoing work. But he was here. He was breathing, he was trying, and trying, he'd learned, was enough. On the anniversary of the day Rachel found him, he drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. He hadn't been there in years. The gravestone was simple, worn by weather, and he stood there for a long time, trying to find words. "I get it now," he finally said. "Why you waited, why you were scared. The system is broken, Dad. It was broken then and it's broken now. But I can't let that kill me the way it killed you. I have to try, even if it's hard, even if it's unfair. I have to try." The wind moved through the trees. A plane passed overhead. The city continued its endless expansion in the distance, building over the graves of people who'd worked themselves to death, believing that was the cost of dignity. Daniel stood there a while longer, then walked back to his car. He had a shift at the warehouse in an hour. He had a therapy appointment tomorrow. He had medications to take tonight. He had a life that required constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant effort. But it was his life, and it was worth fighting for. Epilogue. The file ends here, recovered from a damaged hard drive found in a storage unit in a city that no longer exists in the way it did when Daniel Carver lived there. We don't know what happened to him after that day at the cemetery. We don't know if he's still alive, still working, still fighting. The record goes silent, as records often do, leaving us with fragments of a story that could belong to thousands of people, millions maybe, caught in the same impossible machinery. What we do know is this: the system he feared didn't change. The bills didn't stop coming. The barriers to care didn't disappear. The American dream he'd been sold his entire life, work hard, play by the rules, and you'll be taken care of, remained what it had always been. A promise with an asterisk, a lottery where most people lost. But Daniel Carver learned something in those months of recovery, something worth remembering: that survival is not a solo act, that asking for help is not weakness, but wisdom, that the systems designed to break us only win when we let them convince us we're not worth saving. He was worth saving. They all are. Every person who avoids the doctor because they can't afford the bill. Every person who works through pain because taking a day off means losing rent money. Every person who waits until it's almost too late because they've been taught that their suffering doesn't matter. This file is for them. A reminder that the choice to live, even in a world designed to make living expensive, is an act of defiance. A refusal to disappear quietly. A small rebellion against a machine that counts on our silence. If this story resonated with you, please support the channel by subscribing and tell me where you're watching from. Your comment helps decide which forgotten file we restore next.